have been preaching for more than 20 years, so I should have seen it coming. It's kind of a rookie mistake, really. You learn early on that you want to be careful with how you title your sermons, because whatever you're going to talk about, you can expect to experience some of that in your own life, right? Like if you're preaching on patience, be careful. You wonder why preachers don't preach on patience very much. It's because we know what that means. That means the week before, the week after, it's going to be a long week. Patience is going to get tested. If you're going to preach on peace, then you just have to expect that some stressful days are going to be coming your way. And so, I should have seen it. I should have seen that last week's title was Overcoming Discouragement. I should have changed the title. It was a JV move. I just wasn't paying attention. Overcoming Discouragement, of course, it's like an invitation. Discourage me. And so it happened Saturday night after the service. I barely get done preaching, and some discouraging people find their way to me. And then before I get home, there's a few more discouraging things that I hear about. And by the time I get to bed Saturday night, I'm just feeling it. I'm just feeling pretty discouraged. I don't sleep much Saturday night. Wake up Sunday morning, I head to church, and here's the position I find myself in. Again, it shouldn't have caught me off guard, but it did. I'm on my way to church feeling discouraged to preach a sermon about overcoming discouragement. And that's just kind of the frustration of life, right? Is that there is always something it seems to feel a little bit discouraged about. We can be hit on every side. We can sometimes feel overwhelmed with it, whether it would be as a nation or whether it would be individually in our own lives. There's a lot that just seems to happen to us. No one's exempt from it. We've seen a lot of that in Joseph's life. I experienced some of that this past week. That's why I was relieved when I saw that the message for this weekend's title is Overcoming Success. All right, that's all right. I can deal with that. If I have to deal with a little success, so be it. The discouragement last week, success this week, I'm hoping it all just kind of comes full circle and it works out, because we don't think of success as something that you have to overcome. We think of overcoming something that we don't want or something we don't desire, that we overcome failure to be successful. But what a lot of you know is that success can be a weight. Success can hold you back. So success can keep you from what God's dream might be for your life, that you can get so caught up in the American dream that you start to forget about what God's dream might have been for you. Success can be consuming, where you stop giving attention to other areas of your life, and so you find success over here, but then all these other areas are kind of falling apart. And so success can be something that has to be overcome. A lot of it, though, depends on how you would define success. So can we start with that? Can we start with just thinking about how you would define success? Take a minute in your own mind. Here's what it means to be successful. I read a lot of definitions of success this past week. Some people saying, well, success is being able to do whatever you want. Other people would say, well, success is reaching a certain level of achievement or a certain level of status, that you set your goals and you reach your goals. But how would you define success? Whatever definition you have, you might also ask yourself, what influenced you to define success that way? Again, it's interesting, if you study the subject of success throughout history, you find that typically people measure success very much based upon the culture, the time and place in which they live, and how we would typically measure success now in our Western world. It's different than how success might have been measured numerous generations ago in other places. So how would you define success, and what influenced your definition of success? Because if you're successful, but it's the wrong success, then isn't that just another way of failing? Maybe you saw this story. It was in the news a number of years ago during the Olympics. I think it was 2004 Olympics. There was an Olympian named Matt Emmons who was competing for the rifle shoot, where he shoot at targets and they add up the scores. And he was well positioned. He was sitting to get first place. All he really needed to do was hit the target, didn't have to get a bullseye. And so he takes aim and he fires, and the shot that he took would normally get a score of like 8.1, which was more than enough, if you remember, for him to get a gold medal. But the problem was that Matt was standing in lane 2, and he shot at the target on accident in lane 3. It was a great shot. Problem is, it was at the wrong target. And so his score was 0, bumped him down to 8th place. I think that's a metaphor for what our lives can sometimes end up looking like, that we do, pretty well. I mean, we take aim and we shoot and it looks good, but then we get to the end of it and we can't help but wonder, was I even aiming at the right target? And so we want to look at the life of Joseph and look at his life through this lens of success and just consider what it looks like to be successful in a way that honors God. Before we get into that, another example of what this might look like would be the rich young ruler that we study in Luke 18. The rich young ruler comes to Jesus and wants to follow Jesus, if you remember the story. And he's successful by anybody's definition. He's rich, he's young, he's powerful, rich young ruler. It's all right there. And Jesus, it's the only time he does this, but Jesus says to him, well, go sell everything you have and then you can come follow me. And the Bible says that he walked away sad. The man walked away sad because he was wealthy. It's an odd thing to say, for somebody to walk away sad because they're rich. You walk away sad because you're successful, but why is he sad? It's because it's just too much. There's too much to overcome. That's too much of a weight, too much money, too much success, too much power. He can't give it up to follow Jesus. And so success then becomes a lot more like failure. Well, in Genesis chapter 41 is where we're studying as we go through the life of Joseph. And just a quick recap up to this point. Joseph grew up in a home with older brothers who were jealous of him. And they, at age 17, sell him into slavery. Seems pretty drastic, but this guy named Potiphar buys Joseph, and Joseph becomes a slave in this foreign land of Egypt. And Potiphar's wife develops this thing for Joseph and keeps pursuing him, making unwanted sexual advancements towards him. And the more Joseph resists, the more she persists. And eventually she makes these false accusations against him that he's the one making these advancements against her. And there's nothing he can do to defend himself. He's a slave. And so he's thrown in prison. That's where we found Joseph last week. He's in prison. There doesn't really seem to be any way out. I mean, there's no release date that's set. There's no appeal process that's available. But in prison, he meets two high-ranking officials that Pharaoh threw into prison. And they each have a dream, and Joseph interprets the dream of the baker, and if you remember, he interprets the dream of the cupbearer, and he tells the cupbearer, hey, in 3 days, here's what your dream means. In 3 days, you're gonna be put back in this position of influence. You're gonna be the cupbearer to Pharaoh, to the king of Egypt once again. And Joseph says, when that happens, remember me. Get me out of this place. Say something to Pharaoh on my behalf. But chapter 40 ends with this verse 23. It just says, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot about him. This was Joseph's one chance. Pharaoh was really the only person on the planet who could do anything about the position he was in as a prisoner. And he's forgotten about, and the days go by, and the weeks go by, and the months go by, nothing happens. Chapter 41 starts off this way. It says, when 2 full years had passed. Now what we're gonna see is that everything changes for Joseph in these upcoming verses, but he didn't know that, right? So for those 2 years, he didn't know things were gonna change. I mean, if somebody could have said to him, hey, look, you got 2 years left of this, bro. You hang in there. You're gonna be in charge of all of Egypt. No problem. No, he could have done okay. I mean, 2 years, as long as I know there's an ending, as long as I know at some point it's gonna get better. He didn't know that. I mean, when he was 17 and had those dreams, if God would have said, hey, when you hit 30, everything's gonna change. Just hang in there from 17 to 30, everything's gonna change. It would have been different, but he didn't know. And some of you have had this where you're discouraged to the place where one more day seems like you just can't do it. But 2 years would seem impossible. And so Joseph spends 2 more years, nothing changes for him. All he has is his faith. And he is learning to rely and be dependent upon God, realizing that a lot of other people, brothers, Potiphar, and now the cupbearer, a lot of other people have let him down. And then after 2 full years, Pharaoh has 2 dreams one night. The king of Egypt has 2 dreams, kind of this double feature. They're weird. You can read them at home, but they're strange and disturbing dreams, so much so that he knows they mean something. And so he does what would be the equivalent of getting up in the middle of the night and Googling it. He calls all of his wise men and all of his magicians together, brings them all together in the same room, and there's thousands of gods and goddesses represented in Egypt, so it's a lot of people. And he says, here are the dreams that I had, tell me what they mean. And they do their magic and they pray to their gods, and they don't know. They don't have any idea what these dreams mean. And so there's a cupbearer, though, standing beside Pharaoh, listening to all this. He listens to Pharaoh tell his dream. He watches as people try to interpret it. He's like, man, something about this seems familiar. You think? Like that time you were in jail and you had a dream and somebody interpreted it correctly? He's like, that's right. And so he speaks up. Finally, he speaks up. Verse 9, finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today, he says, I've been reminded of my failure. And he goes on to tell the king about Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. Verse 14 says, so Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went and stood before Pharaoh. And just like that, it's different. Just like that. For 13 years, he's waited and waited and waited. He's been faithful. It hasn't made sense to him. It's not how he thought things would be. And then just like that, it's different. He woke up that morning. He didn't think it was going to be different. He thought it would be another day just like all the other days. But God had this day circled. God knew about this day on his calendar. And on this day, everything changes for Joseph. He's told to shave, he's given some clean clothes, and then he's brought before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh tells Joseph his dreams, and Joseph, he knows what they mean. Now, in my mind, okay, you've got some leverage, bro. You've got an opportunity here to take some steps forward. I mean, you know something that the most powerful man in the world wants to know. So you would think Joseph would say something like, yeah, I know what that means. But before I tell you, there's some business we need to take care of. Like, I got some brothers. They need to go to jail. Potiphar's wife, yeah, put her in there too. And see that guy standing next to you holding the cup, bearing that cup? Yeah, he needs to spend a couple of years where I just spent. You would think he would kind of go through this list of demands and give me all the gold I can carry, and on my way out, I'll tell you what your dream means. There's part of me that says, look, if you want to be successful, this is what you got to do. You got to leverage what you know. You got to leverage your position. But see, this is not how Joseph operated. Joseph served. Wherever he was at, this is what he did. He served faithfully, took advantage of opportunities when he had them, and then he left the rest up to God. He let God worry about the details. And so Pharaoh says, hey, here are the dreams that I've had, and Joseph doesn't shrink back from the moment. He steps into it, he trusts God, and he hears about the fat cows and the skinny cows and the fat grain and the withered grain. Verse 25. Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. And Joseph goes on to explain that this is a warning from God that there will be 7 years of prosperity followed by 7 years of famine. So this is it, right? Like, he interprets the dream. This is what he has been asked to do. Now it's time, to reap some of the rewards of this. But Joseph doesn't stop there. And what he does next is really risky. He doesn't really pause after interpreting the dream. He goes and he starts telling Pharaoh what he should do because of these dreams. And so this is how it begins, verse 33, after he interprets the dream. Therefore, Pharaoh should. Whoa. You could just feel the room get anxious. I mean, it's awkward and tense. You got this guy who a few hours ago was in prison, hadn't shaved in forever, was dirty and nasty. Now he's standing in front of the king of Egypt saying, hey, let me tell you what you should do, man. Here's what you should do. Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years and have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses, store it away and guard it there so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise this famine will destroy the land. So Joseph speaks up. And it's courageous. So again, what do we find Joseph doing here, right? He is doing everything he can do, and he is trusting God to do what only God can do. And so he says this, and he's like, hey, what you really ought to do is you should find a wise and intelligent leader to put this all together. I mean, if you know of one, Pharaoh. I mean, if you can think of somebody. And he kind of raises his hand for the assignment, essentially. But it would have been ridiculous to think that Pharaoh would choose him. I mean, he's not Egyptian, he's Hebrew. Pharaoh pulls out his resume. Okay, well, let's see if you're qualified. It says here you were a slave, and then you went to prison, and now you want to be in charge of all this? So this is what God does again and again and again, is he chooses people who are not qualified on paper. He chooses people who seem to be disqualified, not have the right credentials. Why? Because he can. He's God. He can use whoever he wants to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants to do it. And Joseph has a confidence in who God is, and so he speaks up, and God uses Pharaoh, moves Pharaoh like he would move a pawn on a chessboard to accomplish his purpose. And Pharaoh says to Joseph, starting in verse 40, Joseph, you will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in a chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, kneel down. And so Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all Egypt, and Pharaoh said to him, I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or a foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval. And so things change for Joseph. Now, the question you got to ask is, does Joseph change? In other words, is success going to change him? Is he going to now get kind of caught up in this Egyptian dream and forget about God's dream for him? It wouldn't be the first time that type of thing had happened. I mean, is success going to become a barrier that would actually keep him from being who God wanted him to be and accomplishing what God had laid out for him to accomplish? And so there's a few things that we see that Joseph does in this moment of success I just want to draw your attention to. First, he recognizes God's hand. He sees that this opportunity he has, the success that he's been given, is because of God's hand on his life. It's because of God's goodness. It's because of God's grace. It's because of God's providence. And so in this moment when he's asked by Pharaoh, can you do this? He doesn't step into the spotlight. Instead, he reflects it to God. And here's what Joseph says in verse 16. He says, no, I can't do this. He says, it's beyond my power to do it, but God can. God can do this. He can tell you what it means, and he can set your mind at ease. So Joseph gets a little recognition. He has this incredible opportunity, and he steps into this success, and his response is, I can't, but God can. And when you have success in your life, this is the response. I can't, God can. I didn't, God did. You understand who you are and the opportunities God has given you. Because when you decide to step into the light and start taking credit for it and say, yeah, I think I could pull that off, Pharaoh. Tell me what it is. And suddenly God withdraws from that. That your pride or your ego or your desire for recognition or an acknowledgement has edged God out of the picture. But the more you recognize his power, the more space you make for it to be demonstrated in your life. That's why the Bible says in Corinthians that his strength is made perfect in weakness. And some of you have experienced the power of this, that when you are vulnerable, if you're humble enough as a leader to say, I don't know, I'm not sure, I can't, that it creates some space for God to demonstrate his strength and his power. When you say to your family, I'm not sure what to do, I'm not sure how to handle it, I don't really know, then you create space for God to step in and to demonstrate his power. And so Joseph does that, says, I can't, but God can. And that would have, I think, been difficult for him as a 17-year-old. Because when he's 17 and he gets this dream from God, it seems to appeal to his ego a little bit. He's telling his brothers, hey, guess who's going to bow down to me one day? He has a different spirit, but after 13 years in slavery and as a prisoner, his dependence and his reliance is fully on God. And in this moment, I think he can see that God has been at work the whole time. It didn't seem like it in the moment. It didn't feel like it when he was going through it. But now he knows. These last 13 years have not been wasted. That God was bringing him to this place for this purpose. There's something that happens in hindsight where we can look back and we can see moments or seasons in life that at the time were discouraging actually had a purpose. And so you go through something difficult and it just seems like it's not fair, it's not right, that job should have been yours, that you thought that person was the right person for you. You thought the promotion was gonna be yours to get. In the moment, it seems like it wasn't fair. But then after a while, and it might be a long while, and some of you are just gonna have to take my word for it, you look back and you can see how God has worked. And it's not that he caused all those things, but it's that he didn't waste those things. And there is an eternal good that we do not understand on this side of heaven. One day we will. A number of years ago, 7 years ago actually, I shared with all of you an exercise I did in this ministry conference, and the person at the conference asked us to reverse engineer God's hand in our lives. So the challenge was look at your position of ministry and then kind of back your way out of it and see how God brought you to the place where you're at. And so I did that. I'm at a church that I love. No other church I'd rather preach at than this church. I love being here. And so I thought, okay, well, how did I end up here? Took a step back. Now, before coming to this church, I started a new church in Los Angeles County. And coming out of seminary, I hadn't really thought about planting a church. I didn't know much about it. So to be honest, it's not what I wanted to do at the moment. I wanted to preach. But coming out of seminary, no one was interested in hiring me to preach. I applied to, I don't know how many churches, a lot, and that were looking for preachers, and no one replied. There was no response. And at the time, that was pretty discouraging because I felt like, hey, this is what God has called me to do. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, and yet he's not giving me an opportunity. And so the only way for me to go preach and to be obedient to what God had called me to do at that time, it seemed like, was to go start a church. And so that's what we did. I never thought I'd be a preacher. If I take a step back from that experience, I thought I was going to be a youth pastor. You should be so thankful that I'm not, because it would not have gone well. But I thought that, when I was a freshman in college, that was my plan. And there are a lot of small churches around the town where I grew up that had like 100 or less people, and they didn't have youth pastors. So I thought, I bet they would let me be their youth pastor. So I sent out all these resumes and wanting to be the youth pastor just on the weekends for these churches that had no youth pastor. And I didn't hear back from any of them. And I remember feeling pretty discouraged at the time because it's not the way I thought it would go. It's what I thought God wanted me to do. Though on a Thursday, a church not far from where I lived called and asked if I'd come preach for them on Sunday. They were desperate. And I'd said yes because, this sounds horrible, but I didn't have anything else to do. And I was just telling you the truth. I'm like, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And I don't remember thinking about it a lot or praying about it. Just on Thursday, hey, there's a church that needs somebody to preach for them. Would you be willing to do it? And that's 10 minutes down the road. Yeah, okay, I'll do that. After I preached that weekend, they asked if I'd come back and preach the next weekend. I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then I came back the next weekend, and there's a church of, 30 or 40 elderly people, and at some point I fell in love with the church, and I fell in love with preaching. Sometimes people ask, when did God call you to preach? And did he speak in an audible voice? Was there a burning bush? I'm like, no, he tricked me into it. That's how my calling worked. He had me doing it before I knew that's what he wanted me to do. But the reason I said yes on that, if I could take another step back, the reason I said yes on that Thursday to preaching at that little church, I was 18, but I felt comfortable doing that because when I was 16, Dave mentioned this a number of weeks ago, so it's out there. When I was 16, I got a job as a tour guide at Precious Moments Chapel. It's not what I wanted. Shocker. Like no high school students ever what I'd like to do one day. No, it's not what I wanted to do. But thousands of guests would come to Precious Moments Chapel, and I'd stand up and talk to them. And so I got comfortable talking in front of people so that when that phone call came on Thursday to have me preach on Sunday, I'm like, yeah, I don't mind doing that. But I I didn't want to get that job at Precious Moments. It was discouraging. It was embarrassing, if we're going to be honest. The pink shirt says Precious Moments on. It's not what I wanted. But I had to get the job. The reason I had to get the job is because after I got my driver's license, I borrowed my mom's car and I drove it to Taco Hut in my hometown. Taco Hut's not a safe place to eat, but it's fast and it's cheap. And Taco Hut was known for their restrooms, and not in a good way. Like, I'd never been in there personally, but stories had been told. And I got done eating at Taco Hut, and I needed to use the restroom. I wasn't going to go in those restrooms. And so I sped home. My house wasn't too far away, so I sped home, pulled my mom's car in the driveway, and got out of the car and ran into the house to use the restroom. I came back out a little bit later, and my mom's car was in the middle of the road. It had rolled down the driveway, smashed through the mailbox, and caused some damage. Apparently, I was in such a hurry to put the car in, I forgot to put the car in park. My parents told me that I needed to help pay for the repairs. I didn't want to. That didn't seem fair. I mean, it seemed like that was on Taco Hut, if anything. I wished things were different, but I had to get a job to pay for the damages. So are you tracking with me on this? The reason I'm here preaching this weekend is because the bathrooms in Taco Hut are a disaster. That's how it works, right? And I would encourage you to do this. I would encourage you to reverse engineer some of how God has been at work in your life. And some of you aren't there yet. I get it. You're still on that journey of trying to see how it's all going to fit together. But I bet there's some ways you can do it. Every weekend almost we witness baptisms. And one of the things you get to hear backstage when you're talking to people getting baptized is this. That they can look back. They didn't see it in the moment. They didn't understand it at the time, but they went through something difficult or challenging, something overwhelming. And it seemed like perhaps maybe the worst thing that happened to them, but it ends up being the best thing that happens to them because God used it for good. God brought them to a different place. And you may not know it now, and you may not realize it now, but don't give up. You stay faithful to God. Joseph was faithful in the prison. He was faithful in the palace. And he was grateful instead of feeling entitled, instead of saying, well, you know what, it's about time I get a break. Do you know how long I've been in prison? Do you know how long I was a slave? It's about time. That's not his spirit. He's thankful. And we see this in the way he names his sons. Genesis 41 says Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it's because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. And the second son he named Ephraim and said, it's because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. So Manasseh's name literally means he who causes to forget. This is Joseph's way of saying, I am not consumed with looking at the past and paying attention to the bad that was done to me. I am moving ahead. I am paying attention to the good in my life. And then his second son, Ephraim's name means God has made me fruitful. So his spirit is not, look what I did. Let me look how it's a comeback story. Underdog, prisoner, now I'm in charge of all of Egypt. It's what God has done. It's on his fruitfulness. And if you are on the journey right now and you're experiencing some success, then I would encourage you to take some time and to remember God, to pay attention to God's faithfulness, to reverse engineer some things in your life. Don't take credit for it. I know there's a tendency to say, well, I've worked hard. Well, who gave you the ability to work hard? I know there's a tendency to say, well, yeah, but I have some gifts. Well, who gave you those gifts? Did you decide your DNA makeup? Did you decide what family you would be born in? Did you decide where you would go to school? Did you decide what challenges you would have? Because if you're like me, you wouldn't pick any of those challenges, but now you can see that they've made you into a certain person that God is using in a certain way. Don't take credit for what God's doing or what God has done. You give him glory, you give him credit for it. And if you're still on the journey and you don't quite see it yet, like it just hasn't come into view and you're tired and you're ready to quit, remember Joseph and you just keep going. Don't give up, be faithful. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I took my wife to Gatlinburg for a few nights, and we were there for 4 days, and we went on different hikes each day, and that's new for me. We hadn't done something like that in the past, and it was great. It's beautiful, and we enjoyed it. But there was one day where we went on a a much more difficult hike than the other days. And I had looked on it on the map, and I knew it was supposed to be more difficult. So as we were getting ready to take off on this trail, I talked to a group of hikers who had just come off the trail, just kind of to engage them a little bit to find out about it. And there's one of them that I could tell, I could tell he was, I think he was concerned about me. I think he just saw the way I was dressed, and he's like, that's a computer bag. That's not actually a hiking backpack. I'm like, is there really a difference though? Yeah, it's probably better that you don't know the answer to that question. And so I could tell they were a little concerned. It was one of the guys said, hey, this is going to be a difficult hike. It's the most difficult one they said that they had done. And when one of them was trying to encourage me though a little bit, he said, but you know what they say? I think he knew that I didn't know what they say. Like, he knew that whatever climbers and hikers say, I wasn't well versed in those sayings. And he said, they say the harder the hike, the better the view. And we started making our way up the trail, and an hour or two into it, I was hurting. I was hurting pretty bad. I was breathing heavy. And I was ready to head back. We started passing people who were on the way down, and they could tell I was hurting. They could see it. They could hear it. They could hear it from like around the corner. Like, what is that noise? And that's me. And so they start trying to encourage me as they pass. Hey, you're getting closer. They lied. Just a little bit further. It'll be worth it when you get to the top. And it just seemed like we were never going to get there. And every time we'd come around a corner, I'd be like, it's got to be right there. And it wasn't. We'd come around another corner. This has to be it. And we finally get there. And it turns out what they say is true, that the harder the hike, the better the view. I don't know where you're at on the journey, but if you're struggling, then don't give up. You be faithful. See, Joseph recognizes God's faithfulness, but he also remained faithful along the way. I don't know for sure, but here's my thinking, is that Joseph didn't define success differently on that day when he stood before Pharaoh as he did the day before when he was a prisoner. I don't think in his mind, okay, now I'm successful because I got the gold chain and I got the sports chariot. I don't think that's how it worked. I don't think he got to that position and said, made it. I think that for Joseph, success was determined much earlier when he decided after he sold into slavery that he is gonna be faithful to God, no matter what happens. And he may have thought he would never get a position. I'm sure he never imagined something happening to him, what happened to him, but he was faithful to God. And success for him is defined as faithfulness. Didn't matter if he was the most powerful man other than Pharaoh in all of Egypt, or if he was a prisoner, or if he was a slave. That did not define success. Success for Joseph was faithfulness to God. And Jesus tells a story in Matthew 25. It's a parable about this master who leaves on a trip for a while, and he leaves some money to 3 servants, tells them to take care of it and to invest it. And the first 2 servants invest it, and when the master returns, they've got something to show for it, and the master says, well done, good and faithful servant. The third servant, though, he's afraid. He's afraid of being unsuccessful. And so he doesn't do anything with it. He just buries it, and when the master returns, he's like, well, I didn't lose anything, but I didn't gain anything. Here's your money back. And the master says in this story for him to be thrown out into darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But the two servants, he says, well done, good, not good and successful servants. He says, well done, good and faithful servants. Earlier, I asked you to define success. To be honest, it's a hard question. Most people have a hard time kind of coming up with a genuine answer. We tend to revert back to some saying or something we've heard before. I don't know what came to your mind. But if you need a definition of success, it's standing before God one day and hearing him say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Let's pray. God, I thank you that you are at work, and even when we feel discouraged and even when we are confused and we don't understand, God, I thank you that you are faithful. In fact, God, you tell us that even when we're faithless, you are faithful, that you're still going to take some things that we surrender to you and you can still work them out for your good and for our good and your glory. And God, I pray that you would help us recognize today that it's not, it's not just being faithful. It is your grace that allows us to even have the opportunity. That Jesus, you did for us what we couldn't earn or we couldn't do for ourselves, that you made us right. And so God, out of that gift that you've given us, would you help us live faithful lives? There's going to be some unexpected twists and turns, and things aren't going to go how we'd planned, and there are going to be moments where we just feel like we got the breath knocked out of us. But God, would you help us then to turn our eyes to you and remember that you have not left us, that you are with us, and that you are working things together for good. That is our hope. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. If you want to talk to someone about your relationship with Jesus and putting your trust, your hope in him, you can meet me down front over here. Or if you're ready to become a part of this church family, we'd love to have you at Southeast. Again, you can come down front. Let's stand and let's worship our great God.